worked hard your whole life to get where you are. You've built expertise, earned respect, and climbed to the top of your game. But now it feels as if the brain is not your own. Words vanish mid-sentence, focus slips through your fingers, and none of the usual strategies you've developed over the years are working. You're exhausted, emotional, and worse still, suddenly questioning if you've lost your edge. You haven't. What you may be dealing with is the not-so-fun cocktail of menopause and ADHD. Millions of women are in the same boat, but research hasn't really caught up. I'm Lisa Allen, and my geek out zone is neuroscience, the interplay of systems, and the brain and behaviour. I weave my knowledge through coaching teams, leaders, and people exploring new horizons. I'm stoked to be a part of this podcast series called The Fog and the Fury, where we finally explore what happens when ADHD and menopause collide. Each week, we'll sit down with leading neuroscientists, researchers, and women who know about this firsthand. We'll tackle the biology, the psychology, and the stigma, and we'll share practical and science-based strategies you can actually use. Because the fog is real, the fury is valid, and if you've ever lost your train of thought in the middle of an important meeting, or your brain feels like a computer with too many tabs open, this podcast is for you. Hi, welcome everyone, and welcome to our guest today, Dr. Lily Rosewater. Welcome, Lily.
Thank you so much for having me.
Lily is joining us from Australia. She has a PhD in neuroscience and more than a decade at the lab bench as a researcher. She has a collection of published papers and awards for her research and has now turned her experience and skills to science communication. As a neuroscience and science communicator, she is the founder of Pitch Science and the Neurodivergent Neuroscientists. Pitch Science is a translator between science and real-world everyday speak, so that all the science is accessible to all the everyday people like you and I. The neurodivergent neuroscientist is about bridging the empathy gap between neurotypes. It takes emerging neuroscience of neurodivergency and transforms it into tools for self-compassion, self-understanding, and self-awareness so that neurodivergent people can create a map and navigate the world more effectively. And she also works with allies and workplaces and provides services to help them to better understand and make workplaces more neuro-inclusive. All of Lily's work has a strong scientific basis. She deeply believes in the importance of everything being grounded in sound scientific process. And while not yet at the perimenopause or menopause stage of life, she works with women who do fit into an experience of menopause and ADHD. So welcome, Lily.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And anything else that you'd like to add about your story to help us along today?
Other than just the fact that I'm autistic and ADHD myself, late diagnosed as an adult, so that's kind of also why the neurodivergent neuroscientist came to be. Other than that, I feel like you covered my kind of career journey pretty well.
Nice. And it's so important to have a lived experience perspective on all of this. I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think honestly, there's something that comes from talking within neurotypes. So when I work with other neurodivergent women, I think that lived experience and ability to communicate in the same way is just so important. We know that there's this thing called the double empathy gap, which is the idea that, you know, traditionally we've thought that neurodivergent people might not be so great at communication, but actually it's a two-way miscommunication, and neurotypical people are equally at fault, essentially. And it's an issue with empathy in both directions and understanding in both directions. And so by myself having that lived experience and kind of the same style of communication, I can really work with other people who are in a similar boat and kind of want to work with their neurodivergent brains in a way that potentially people who are not neurodivergent might struggle to kind of get those points across, or at least kind of empathize on that deeper level. So I think it's a really important part of my work that I bring that lived experience. And it just means we're kind of talking in the same space, and I kind of get everything they're talking about. So there's no judgment, you know, if they're fidgeting or they're not making eye contact or whatever else, like I completely understand.
Yeah, brilliant. You raise an interesting point there just around the two-way communication, which is a really nice way of putting it, actually. And I wonder about kind of often the narrative out there is that it's a disorder. It's these things have a classification under the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic tool for mental health disorders. I know that you have a slightly different take on this.
I do. I think for me and my understanding, and also from reading the literature, it is about neurotypes. So it's natural human diversity. And I think the neurodiversity movement as a whole is a social movement and somewhat trying to move away from that medical model. I feel like I straddle both sides of the fence in that I really passionately care about science and research, but then I also am just so passionate that it is not a disorder. And it's more about learning to work with basically just a different operating system. So I often talk about it as Windows versus Mac. And when you're trying to run programs that are designed for a Windows machine on a Mac brain, things just aren't going to kind of work as well. And you're going to end up with some, system errors. And so I really try and kind of take the disorderness out of it and really just focus on, human differences and working with a different operating system. Because I think as soon as you start viewing it as a disorder, there's that feeling of brokenness. And that's where a lot of the kind of lack of self-compassion comes from, is that feeling of being broken. But if you can strip away that emotionality and just view it as a different operating system, that's already like that first step to kind of feeling a bit more kind of self-accepting.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that kind of concept of brokenness, as a person who doesn't have a diagnosis, but certainly has had a real increase in what could be termed ADHD type symptoms in menopause. It's really prompted me to look at this in more detail, and I can relate to a lot of these things earlier in life.
Yeah.
I'm wondering kind of about what shifts you see happening for people as they traverse the different stages of life cycle, particularly in women.
Yeah, so a lot of the women I work with are, I mean, they're all adults. So I get people from their 20s up to, menopause and onwards. And I think when I see women who are in their kind of early 20s or mid 20s, it's all about like figuring out those coping strategies that really work for them, even, into the 30s. And it's about building up those systems that do work. And then when I see people who are maybe in their late 30s to 40s, they feel like they've kind of got it. They've figured out coping strategies and mechanisms to work within a world that's not really built for them. And then once I kind of reach the more perimenopause and menopausal women, it almost does like a 180, because a lot of the coping strategies that they might have developed throughout kind of their adulthood start to falter as they get kind of that impact of the reducing estrogen on their ADHD. So it's then becoming, well, like, this worked for the last 20, 30 years and I figured that out on my own, but now it's the cracks are starting to show, or like it's not really kind of working anymore, and I need to develop new strategies to kind of cope with executive dysfunction or, rejection sensitivity. And so it kind of goes back to, let's figure out some kind of more coping strategies that are going to work with where your brain's at now. So it's kind of this almost like U-shape in terms of what their needs are.
Is there something different that happens at menopause, perimenopause, as opposed to other parts of the cycle? For instance, normal cycles with our period, for women going into pregnancy, and I guess even before their adolescence.
Yeah, so there's definitely like changes in terms of kind of those sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone. And so, for example, when people are having natural menstrual cycles, there is a dip in estrogen just prior to menstruation. And that exacerbates ADHD symptoms. That luteal phase, people really do kind of get a heightening in symptoms. And we know that if they, or at least there's early studies to show, that if they increase their ADHD medication dosage, just specifically premenstrual, it can kind of counteract that. So it's definitely that tie between dopamine and estrogen that we know exists in the brain. There's less evidence and less studies at menopause because historically research has neglected women, especially neurodivergent women. But from what I have seen, there's definitely a similar sort of kind of symptom increase at menopause, which makes sense if you think about it, because if we see a symptom increase with estrogen declining in the kind of menstrual cycle, Obviously, menopause is that, but without kind of the same going back up as the menstruation has happened. So a lot of the women, instead of being kind of like a cyclical thing where they might feel, an exacerbation of symptoms just before their period, oh, excuse me, and then it gets better again and they kind of get kind of more executive function gets better. It's a more prolonged kind of period of time for them where they're now having to adjust to this kind of new state of life where they might not get that estrogen back. And so they're now figuring out their new brain as they kind of have this more heightened ADHD as that estrogen is continuing to drop off without, bouncing back in a few weeks' time.
Yeah, I'm wondering what impact that has on energy for women. I know many of the women I speak with have that kind of shift in our energy levels. And I'm wondering how much of this might be due to, I guess, that kind of tension with trying to put new strategies in place.
I think that's definitely a part of it, is that as you're trying to put new strategies, that is a very energy demanding process. I often talk about neurodivergent energy as a whole because it's a very finite resource in a way that kind of more neurotypical people don't have in the same way. So neurodivergent energy is so precious and we have a less energy, we give out a lot more. Everything kind of takes a lot more out of us. And that's not an inherently bad thing. It's just, again, like a different operating system in terms of our energy levels. And so when we are having to make a lot of changes and adaptations, that takes more energy from us. And if dopamine and estrogen are so intricately linked, and it is tied to things like mood, cognition, and everything else, then it makes sense that there would be energy issues because, your brain is not operating kind of at peak dopamine. And if you're already someone who kind of has dopamine dysregulation, then you are going to feel that impact on your energy and your cognition a lot more. Again, like there's just not enough research in this space, but anecdotally from the women I speak to as well, there is a lot of kind of energy issues and overwhelm from one, new systems, and two, heightened executive dysfunction and that impact on their lives.
Mm. And do all of the women or most of the women that you work with, do they have a formal diagnosis of ADHD? Because one of the things that I guess has come up in my conversations and my networks around this is some people who kind of relate to a lot of these things, but they're like, is it just that some of the symptoms of menopause are similar to those to ADHD, or is it undiagnosed ADHD?
Yeah, so a lot of them do not have formal diagnoses. Some of
Mm.
them definitely do. A lot of them have children who have been diagnosed either in adulthood or childhood with autism and ADHD. So there's that family link, and it might just be that they have been missed. So a lot of the time it's kind of, well, if all of my kids, have these diagnoses, that there's a good chance that I do as well. I mean, ultimately it's a genetic kind of thing. But I think as well, I often have the discussion because I think people almost want to invalidate themselves in a way of like, this might be my lived experience at menopause, but it can't be ADHD. Like someone would have kind of figured it out by now. And I
Mm.
often kind of go back to, well, think about when you were a child, think about when you were a teenager. Because if you've managed to create all these coping strategies in adulthood, for example, you might not have been kind of struggling as much with your ADHD in your, say, 20s, 30s, 40s. But if you look back to your childhood and really relate to it then the chances are that you do indeed have ADHD. Like when you go for diagnostic assessments, they do look at your childhood in your school reports and
Mm.
everything else. So it's about that kind of longevity. If it's something that's really only come on, with perimenopause or menopause, then potentially it's not ADHD and it might just be those menopausal symptoms. And it can be really hard to detangle it. So it's about kind
Mm.
of taking that kind of bird's eye view of life. And a
Mm.
lot of the time when I speak to the women who are kind of self-diagnosed, it's if you look at that bird's eye view and you look at their family, that self-diagnosis is a valid thing.
Mm. And I guess it's an experience, isn't it? I mean, there's that, I guess, toss up between lived experience and scientific rigor. And I know that both of those are really important to you. How do you kind of weigh those up in your work, Lily?
I think for me, lived experience is always more important when it comes to self-identification.
Okay.
So I believe so much in science, but I can also recognize, as someone who has formal diagnoses, that that process is extremely inaccessible and it comes with a lot of biases. There's a lot of issues with physicians and psychiatrists not believing women or not listening to women. And that's not just in, ADHD, autism,
Yeah.
neurodivergence, that's across the board, right? And I think it does a disservice to women to just ignore their lived experience just because they haven't had a psychiatrist say, you have ADHD, right? When it costs thousands of dollars, for example, to get those kind of pieces of paper. It's a different thing if people want to get medication, because obviously that does require, that formal diagnosis to be giving stimulant medications out. But a lot of the women I talk to aren't actually looking for medication. They're just looking for that kind of reassurance and kind of self-understanding. And there's no harm in getting that. Like, it doesn't
Mm.
impact anyone else. You're not doing anything dangerous. There's no issues in terms of safety. So when I talk to people, I really just try and help them kind of get a better understanding of themselves, no matter what that means, by using the science. But
Okay.
I don't want to penalize people ever for not having those formal diagnoses, because at the end of the day, that's a system that's just extremely inaccessible at this point.
That's a really interesting phrase. Use the science to get a better understanding of themselves.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit more about that and how that works.
So basically, what a lot of my work is through what I call brain discovery calls, which
Uh-huh.
is almost like let's discover your brain together. And so I sit and I dig through all of the literature on the neuroscience of neurodivergence, and I essentially have a bunch of slides that I kind of draw on different topics. And it really is kind of self-guided. So people will come to me and say, I'm really struggling with rejection sensitivity, or I'm really struggling with kind of my sensory issues, or kind of, XYZ. And we sit there and I kind of just give them the context scientifically, because I think when you have a better understanding of what's actually kind of going on in your brain, you just get that self-compassion a little bit more. And so it's kind of helping people feel like it's not something that's broken, it's just, like a different way of being.
Mm.
And so it's really just about breaking down that science so they can apply it to their everyday lives. There's a lot of neuroscience being used in well-being, which is great, but a lot of it is not accessible to neurodivergent people. So it's really trying to fill that gap so that they get those kind of well-being advice, but actually backed by the science that is relevant to them.
So when you say a lot of that well-being material isn't accessible to neurodivergent people,
Mhm.
in what ways?
I mean, for one, they're not included in the studies. So,
So it's a huge research gap. They're
it's a
considered an
huge
outlier.
research gap.
Okay.
But also, I think, especially when it comes to things like productivity advice, for example,
Mhm.
again, it's like a different way of being. I often talk about like a car versus a train. So a neurotypical person is a car. They're really great at like getting in the car, turning the ignition on, zipping about, getting their task done, and turning the car off, right? A neurodivergent person is like a steam train. So you need to spend time getting all that coal in. It takes time to build up that momentum. But once you're going, you can go very long distances and it's really hard to stop. And it's a completely different way of working. So you can't just hop to your desk necessarily and like tick 10 tasks off your to-do list and call it a day. But what you're really good at is building up that momentum and then really getting a big task done. And so that kind of is one example, but it's across the board. So there's so many things, even when you're looking at stuff like sensory profiles and kind of that hypo and hypersensitivity to sensory inputs and the importance of that. It's a completely different way of being compared to neurotypical people who that isn't such a kind of big player in their well-being. And so it's a combination of neurodivergent people aren't included in those studies, and there's not enough studies into neurodivergent well-being as a whole. But because of these different kind of parts of well-being anyway, it's just not going to be applicable. So it's about trying to find that middle ground of, well, what is working and what isn't working, and then working with that nervous system to kind of have better well-being and better productivity, for example.
Yeah, it's as you were talking about the car and steam train, which is a really nice analogy, just around the fact that others just turn on the car, for instance, around planning an organisation,
Mhm.
whereas it's a really conscious activity of putting the coal into the fire every day to make sure, and then consciously keeping that stoked rather than just waiting weeks until you need to refill your card. Also, I'm just thinking as well about that. For me, I think about things being a marathon or things being a sprint. And when you were speaking about once the steam train's going, it's hard to stop. And some of these things around hyperfocus.
Yes.
So let's talk about that a little bit.
I am really passionate about hyperfocus as a really positive thing. There was a 2023 study that basically tried to compare hyperfocus to flow states, because flow state is kind of a very neurotypical way of thinking about it. And it's really big in positive psychology. So it's this idea that once you're like extremely and passionately immersed in a task, it's kind of the best thing ever. But then hyperfocus, it's not treated the same way. It's often kind of seen as an issue. Like I know for autistic people, a lot of autism intervention programs, quote unquote, are designed to actually reduce hyperfocus and narrow and intense interests. So this study was actually in autistic adults, but it kind of should go across because both autistic and ADHD do experience hyperfocus. But it's a great feeling. And what the researchers found was that hyperfocus is a positive influence on neurodivergent people, and that actually we should be not only allowing hyperfocus, but encouraging it and celebrating it as kind of a unique way of working. So it's not something that should be kind of like pushed aside, and it should be something that has a balance, you know, like you don't want to be not going to the toilet, for example. But, you know, that feeling of just total absorption in a task and the achievement that you can kind of feel from that. You know, the people were quoting that study of, you know, it's the most amazing feeling in the world, or like I walk in a different world, right? It's so positive. And so I really encourage a lot of people I talk to embrace that hyperfocus when it hits, because it can just feel really nice.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I certainly get that hyperfocus once I'm on, and I'll just keep going and going and going. Forget to eat is a thing that I'll particularly do if I'm really kind of enjoying something. And you mentioned there before about the nervous system, and I guess I've not really heard somebody talk about neurodiversity in relationship with our nervous system.
Yeah.
What's that about? What's that link?
So I think of the neurodivergent nervous system as something that's just hypersensitive, basically. So the window of tolerance is a little bit lower. It's really hard to go from rest to action, action to rest. But we also don't tend to sit in those kind of more neutral zones. It's really easy to swing too far. So I talk about it as the seesaw of neurodivergence. So it's really easy to swing into meltdown and overwhelm and kind of that executive dysfunction. And then and there's also easy to swing the other way into executive dysfunction and kind of almost like a shutdown state. And so it ends up kind of being a bit more of a kind of like flip between extreme states versus sitting in that comfortable middle ground. But it's also, you know, there's fundamental differences in how neurodivergent brains are wired. There's just fundamental differences in how that wiring looks. So there's a hyperconnectivity in autistic brains, for example, and there's also extra NMDA receptors. So what this means is NMDA receptors are really integral to learning and memory. And so they are how you have that synaptic plasticity. When you have extra NMDA receptors, your neurons create more spines. And we see that if we look at autistic brains, they have more spines in their neurons, in their memory centers. And this means you're more vulnerable, for example, to things like trauma. So there's this hypersensitivity to the world that you don't get elsewhere. And that's also part of this seesaw of neurodivergence. So there's kind of this emerging research, I guess, in this space that is showing that it's a slightly different nervous system. And so that's something that really needs to be taken into account when you're looking at well-being, because if someone's hyper vulnerable to trauma, for example, and then being neurodivergent in this world can be a trauma in and of itself, you have to be taking all of that into account a lot more. So
you mentioned that in relation to autism.
Yes.
Is that the case with ADHD as well?
It's hard to know, and this is something that comes up again and again. It's this idea that there's actually a huge overlap between autism and ADHD, and that's kind of been termed ADHD. And So it makes it really difficult because studies are not necessarily differentiating between the two or screening. So we know that between 20 to 50% of people with ADHD are also autistic. So it's up to half of people, and up to 70% of autistic people are also ADHD, especially people who are high masking, which tends to be the late diagnosed people. And so a lot of these studies that aren't teasing out those differences, it's a lot harder to make inferences of, oh, it does happen in autism and not ADHD, because the sample is kind of, it's inherently mixed in a way that ideally it wouldn't be. And then there's not enough studies into ADHD itself, so we don't actually know how that interacts. So it probably is the case for ADHD, but we actually can't say at this point in time with certainty because the research just isn't clear enough.
And am I correct as well that it's relatively recently, I think it's 2013, prior to that, there wasn't able to be a dual diagnosis of the two?
Yes, so that was when the DSM-5 came out in 2013. They, for the first time, allowed autism and ADHD to be diagnosed together. So before that, it wasn't possible. It's now we're realizing that actually a lot of people have both. And so that was a huge error. And it has meant that a lot of people who were diagnosed previously or even diagnosed today, that bias has still continued into psychiatry. So they still think it's a lot of the time unlikely to be both. But actually, the research shows that that's not the case. And there is a huge overlap. And so it's really difficult when before 2013, it wasn't even a thing. So it's even more recent.
And I guess with the menopause, perimenopause period, we know, and correct me if I'm incorrect, but if I've misunderstood, but that one of the main kind of chemicals that interact with dopamine is estrogen, and that ADHD is a dopamine regulation issue, and therefore at menopause and perimenopause, you would see a heightening of experience or of symptoms, for want of a better word. With that autism aspect, which we'll just touch on, even though it's not the focus of this podcast, but it does sound like there is some crossover. Would we expect to see a similar thing, or do we not understand if there's a relationship between those hormones, or what the relationship is? Because everything, I think, pretty much has a hormonal impact.
Actually, we know more autism. So there is a study that did show that autistic traits increase with menopause. And it's, again, it's still limited research, but at least there is some research, whereas with the menopausal transition and ADHD, there's really nothing. But we do know that autistic traits do increase with menopause. And so if you are ADHD, you might be experiencing increase in autistic traits and ADHD traits with menopause and perimenopause. And so it is that interaction effect can make things really difficult. So if you are particularly sensory sensitive because you're autistic, that might make the executive dysfunction increase for ADHD even worse, for example. And that interplay is a very difficult thing to manage. And that's why these studies need to actually be accounting for this overlap, because you can't tease out what is different things. For example, that autistic traits increasing with menopause, we don't know probably how much that could be down to ADHD, for example. It's all very compounded and mixed. So there just needs to be a lot more work teasing out the two. But we do know that autistic traits do increase with menopause.
So really what we're seeing here is just a huge, what's the word, a huge colliding of, I guess, lack of research into autism, into ADHD, into the two dual, into those in the female context,
yes,
as well. And then lack of lived experience coming into that as well, probably because of the lack of females involved in research up till now.
Yes. And then there's also the issue with the fact that a lot of neurodivergent people are chronically ill, so they tend to get screened out of studies as a compounding thing. And then, so particularly neurodivergent women are more likely to be chronically ill. So then you also have that impacting the gender biases as well, in terms of when they try and, in good faith, get rid of compounding factors, but then it can also change the sample slightly. So there's a few different things happening, but it's male lens of research as a whole. And that's not just within neurodivergence, that's just within brain health. But then it's kind of a particular issue for neurodivergence, especially because we're only really now understanding the high masking neurodivergence presentations, how that presents, which is primarily in these diagnosed women, not solely, but so it's kind of coming from all angles. It's just this lack of research that's making it difficult to give those more concrete answers to people.
High masking as opposed to masking. What
Yes.
are these? Like, my understanding is masking is where one covers up how they're feeling or what they're doing by doing something which is more socially acceptable, but that could be a very crude understanding of it.
Masking has layers. So there's definitely that conscious masking of trying to come off as socially acceptable. And then there's that more ingrained or subconscious masking that has been conditioned from childhood. And we see that a lot with women. There's expectations on young girls that aren't necessarily placed on young boys as frequently from gender expectations. And so young girls are expected to be more social, for example. And so they get these kind of ingrained behaviors that have been reinforced throughout their childhood. They're not even necessarily conscious they're doing it. And so masking isn't a yes or a no. So instead of thinking about kind of support needs or kind of functioning labels, for example, for autistic people, masking, and this goes for ADHD as well, the level of which you mask is actually probably the best determinant, because ultimately it's not about how autistic or how ADHD you are. It's about how you change or consciously or subconsciously change your behaviors to present to other people. So it's less about your internal experience and it's more about how you present externally. And so high masking people are the ones who tend to get missed because they're really good at camouflage. And then if you're lower masking, obviously people can tell because you're not masking. And so it's really about that external presentation. But someone can be low masking and someone can be high masking, and their actual lived experience can be pretty similar apart from masking. So it's more about that external than the internal.
Right. So somebody internally might be having quite a similar feeling, but on the outside, one person might look like they've got it together.
Yes.
And the other might not, purely because of those masking skills, which you talked about as being conscious or subconscious. And I'm imagining that the subconscious are potentially ones that were ingrained, were started to be practiced in childhood. So they've just become such a natural part. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, so like it's a learned response, and some of it can also be a fear response to that threat or a trigger. So it also becomes a learned response through getting through that trauma.
Yeah.
So there's actually 4 layers to masking. So you have conscious masking, which is that active decision. You have ingrained masking, which is the learned response that started consciously, but now becomes the default. There's instinctive masking, so that's the fear response. And there's subconscious masking, which is created by the person, but they don't really understand they're necessarily doing it. And that can still be somewhat of a learned response, but it didn't start consciously. And when you're high masking, there's kind of unique, I guess, things that come along with that. So you're more likely to be anxious and depressed, and you have trouble necessarily with your emotions, and you might come across as a highly sensitive person, which I see a lot of people say that I'm a highly sensitive person. And you can be that social chameleon, but you don't actually understand the social kind of behaviors that you're mirroring. So you can do them, but you don't understand why they're there. And so I often try and help people with unmasking, which is a very long process. And I'm not sure it ever really is finished, but it's getting rid of some people-pleasing behaviors, for example, or trying to stop controlling yourself quite so much. You're really trying to peel back that conscious mask. But it does have a lot of layers to it. And it's kind of that continuous journey where you think you might have finished unmasking and then you peel back another layer and you're like, oh, I have another ingrained response that I didn't know that I had.
I'm thinking about this fear response that you're talking about and going back to your discussion earlier about energy levels. And we have a limited amount of fuel in our brain, I guess, and that these masking behaviors must use up some of our fuel.
So much. It is very energy demanding because you end up in a state of hypervigilance, essentially, which is it just takes a lot out of someone to do. So I often talk about spoon theory, which is from the disabled community, which is the idea we wake up with a set number of spoons. It's not necessarily the same number of spoons a day, but we have a finite number of spoons and we have to use them wisely. And if you go through your day every day high masking, you are often giving out quite a lot of your spoons to maintaining that mask. which isn't going to leave enough spoons for everything else you need to do. So it's kind of about that energy management side of things. It also has an added component of forks. If you can only get stabbed by a certain number of forks each day, so that's more the incoming energy. You might be able to go around the day with one fork in your arm, but you've got four, it might be a bit of a problem. But really being conscious of the energy and almost having an accounting system for it can really understand. So some people work better with numbers. They might put an arbitrary number from 0 to 100 for each withdrawal and deposit they make each day to their energy. So it might be that cooking dinner with their partner, that is a deposit to their energy. They get 20 energy points from that, but maintaining the mask is 100 out. So then they need to still make up 80 points of energy to be at a neutral. And once you're working in a deficit all the time, that's when you're on your way to burnout and more issues in terms of maintaining your quality of life.
And when you were talking about that around withdrawals and deposits, and going back to your earlier point around the hyper focus, and that we sometimes have hyper focus, and so would leaning into that hyper focus potentially enable us to get some more credits on board as well?
It's really about what feels good, right? So if hyperfocus feels good, then it's definitely going to be bringing in energy. And it's a great way of not withdrawing energy for work. Engaging with those interests, or engaging with hobbies, or having food that's really nice, or having sensory lights. All these things are deposits. And then things like sensory overload, or working on a task you just hate, or maintaining a high mask state. All of those things are those more withdrawal side of things.
Right. I'm just going to go back a little bit to your brain discovery course.
Yes.
And when you were talking about how it's about understanding their own brain, and to me it's that, I guess, that knowledge is power, but also the knowing that underneath all of that masking is a real you, or a real person in that identity, that it's okay to be like this. It's not necessarily a deficit, and a degree of self-empathy and acceptance. And how much do you find working with people, like both in terms of a diagnosis of ADHD, but then you layer on top of that menopause, in what ways can women get at that sense of self-acceptance through all of this?
I think I often call it the process of grief and relief. So you grieve the fact that you didn't have that understanding, or that you were missed, and all the opportunities or impact that's had on your life. Because I think it's really hard to go through the self-discovery process and not grieve, especially for your child's self. I think there's a feeling of real grief for the child inside, but then there's that relief as well of like, well, I have this moving forwards, and now I have a better understanding. And so that process really comes through. I often have people crying on my calls, which I actually find really lovely, because it shows that they are actually going through that process, and it's not just information for information's sake. There's real power, like you said, in knowledge. And so I think for these women, it's often a case of understanding that it's just their neurotype. It's not an inherently bad or good thing. It's just a thing. And it's even things when it comes to self-compassion. I have neurodivergent affirmations, because I think a lot of affirmations for neurotypical people don't tend to work as well. And I often get people push back, like, I don't want to look at affirmations. I hate them. They never work for me. And then when I go through what I think are neurodivergent affirmations, they're like, oh no, these do work. And so I think it's really just about that self-acceptance and being like, well, a lot of the affirmations are, I'm not perfect, but I'm also not bad. I'm not in trouble. I'm just a person. Like, I don't know how to do everything, but no one knows how to do everything. You're kind of a bit more in that, living in that gray area, because I think when you have grown up in a world that's not built for you, you end up very black and white about, well, I'm just terrible at life, or I'm not a good person, and so I think it's about finding that middle ground for people as they discover themselves, essentially, and taking that emotionality out of it in a way. So it's just, I'm a person like everyone else.
So there's a lot out there on social media, more so in the public arena these days, just around ADHD, but also around menopause. And I know that has its plus sides, but can also have its negative sides as well. I know when we were doing our research for this podcast series, and we put in some things that came up with people who were typically quite well known, talking about menopause, talking about ADHD, but we found it really difficult to find those who are actually researchers in this space. And I think we're interviewing 5 people for this, and 4 of them are researchers. And it took us, we had to do a really conscious deep dive. In what ways do you think, there's a lot of fake facts and all the terminology that's out there, in what ways do you think that social media algorithms help and hinder us in this?
I really do believe in the power of social media in terms of finding community. And so I think social media to me serves 2 purposes. And I think it's really about helping people understand that it serves these 2 purposes and they're not necessarily the same thing. So the first is finding that community, finding other people with lived experience, feeling less alone, and really just building up that kind of feeling of support and community. The second is getting accurate information and facts. And this can't necessarily always come from people with lived experience in terms of the actual scientific backing. And so it's always, if you are looking for that community, then definitely just go for people with lived experience, and that makes complete sense. If you're looking for the scientific backing, that's when you need to start looking into, well, what is the credentials of that person to be sharing this information? Are they sharing citations, for example, or are they cherry picking by not sharing that citation? And I'm always wary of people who give very, very concrete answers. I think there's something very reassuring about concrete answers and we all gravitate towards them. But that tends to be where misinformation lies. So if that person isn't often saying like, but we don't know fully, or there still needs to be more research, and they're always promising certainty, that's also an issue. And so I think it's about just really making sure that if you're looking for information, making sure that's coming from a reliable source. So whether that's a doctor or a researcher or someone who has the educational background to do that research and share it accurately, that's a really important part of it. So yeah, it's about really recognizing that social media has those 2 functions, not just, you can't get necessarily both in one.
So look for citations and look for credentials of the person information is coming from, and lived experience is great for community and ideas.
Yes.
And I guess some stuff you're going to try that might not have a scientific basis, but you feel it works for you. Your experience is it works for you.
Definitely. And there's definitely, the science is so new and so recent. We don't have all the answers in research. And so there's definitely going to be things that don't necessarily have that peer-reviewed study underneath them that might work for people. Yeah. It's more when it comes to people who claim medications or certain supplements or those kind of more concrete medical answers, that's when you need to be really wary. But if it's just, this really works for me, maybe it'll work for you, and it's something really small, like implementing a tool in your day to help you make decisions, like a decision wheel, that is completely harmless, and that makes complete sense to be within a community space. So it really depends on what kind of information you're looking at as well. I spend a lot of my time in the research. So yes. I do have people I have online for community space, for example. But when I'm looking for answers, I tend to turn to the research, and that's just because that's my backing and my experience is that I just like reading research. There's definitely people out there, but I think there's also the issue that a lot of, and this is my other business pitch, science comes in, a lot of the researchers and the scientists aren't necessarily sharing online. And so it is harder to find those people. So once you do find them, you have to grab on and hold on to them. But a lot of those quote unquote experts aren't necessarily as visible. So it is harder to find those accurate places of at least scientific information. But yeah, there's plenty of people with the community side of things.
So all those scientists out there, get hold of Dr. Lily. She can help you communicate and stop your research being hidden.
That is literally my entire other business.
Great. So just before we finish up, as a young woman who does have an experience of ADHD and autism and is yet to reach the joys of perimenopause and menopause, what would you love to see in the research space? What do you feel is a priority in this space?
I think for me, there's 2 key things. The first is that I'm passionate about this across the board, not just necessarily for menopause research, but the idea of integrating neurodivergence as a variable that's accounted for in analysis in the same way that we account for sex as a biological variable. Particularly on larger scale studies, it's not necessarily possible when there's a small sample size. But I'm just really passionate that if we were to integrate neurodivergence as a biological variable in these larger population style studies, we would get answers and understanding a lot faster. So that's a huge kind of thing that I advocate for.
Mm.
Other than that, I think it's really for me centering that lived experience. So I think the researchers need to talk to women who are in the perimenopause and menopausal phases and with ADHD, really talk about what matters to them. So it might be executive dysfunction, it might be rejection sensitivity, for example, and then actually doing tangible practical studies on how to help with that. So rather than treating things as a disorder that needs to be cured, actually be like, right, so what supports could be implemented to help people? Because I think, to me, science is there for practical implementation.
Mm.
And so taking that next step, I'm finding out what practical strategies would be useful to people that they can implement would be beneficial, especially non-pharmaceutical implementation. So not necessarily just take more stimulant drugs, because not everyone wants to take stimulants, but actually looking at the more practical everyday side of things. I think that's really where there's a gap, and that's in health research as a whole. But I think it's very much important in this space, especially because I think we're on the back foot. Because we've gone without research for so long, it needs to be fast tracked into practicality to an extent. Obviously, the basic research still needs to be done, but I think actually doing practical things for women should be at the forefront.
Bringing citizen science
Yes.
into the picture to help escalate whichever
Yeah.
news are prioritised.
I'm very passionate of the nothing for us without us mentality. So it needs to always have lived experience at its core. It needs to have it. I think that having a informing committee, for example, for research, all people with lived experience, they can actually have an input. It's not necessarily vetoing studies, but always bringing it back to how will this help the community? How will this help people with lived experience? And actually having that dialogue with people is just so important and often an ignored step, but nothing should be done for us without us.
Absolutely, absolutely. Grounded in real world experience and practical solutions.
Yes,
Yeah,
definitely.
great. Oh, well, hopefully this conversation and this podcast series will be a bit of a genesis for a few more people participating in that conversation, into that scientific conversation. Anything else that you would love to share before we close up today, Lily?
Oh, I don't think, I feel like we've covered a whole range of things that impact people. I think honestly, at the end of the day, it's all about just getting that self-understanding and getting support where you can, whether that's from your loved ones, from the internet in reasonable sources. I think it's just all about understanding that life is hard
Mm.
and it's hard as a neurodivergent person, and having that self-compassion when things are tough. And yeah, just understanding that you're not broken, there's nothing wrong with you. You just function slightly differently, and that's not a bad thing.
That brings some strength to
Yeah.
our world as well.
There's
Yeah.
definitely benefits to being neurodivergent. There's a lot of problems, and like I said, society's not built necessarily for neurodivergent brains, but you bring a lot of unique strengths as well, and just like everyone does, right? And so I think just stripping that negativity from the experience and the stigma as well, like there's a lot of stigma around being neurodivergent, and just really having that process of self-acceptance, whether that is the grief and relief cycle. It's very powerful. And I think a lot of women, once they go through that process, feel a lot better for it.
And adding to that, some of the stigma around the perimenopause and menopausal phase as well. Well,
No,
thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so
my
much for
pleasure.
your clear explanations and for traversing such a broad range of aspects of neurodiversity and the female life cycle.
No, my
Um,
absolute pleasure. It's been lovely to talk to you.
and hopefully we'll have the but I will certainly be keeping on following you through your Instagram post, which I know Lily does post about latest research around that. So do keep an eye out on that and on our next episode. So thank you so much, Lily, for your
Hey,
time.
thank you so much.
We'll share the links to the resources in the show notes. And if any of our listeners have questions or any topics you'd like discussed in future episodes, email us at support@thefogandthefury.com and we'll get back to you. So that's a wrap on this episode of The Fog and the Fury. If your brain's still buzzing or maybe just pleasantly foggy, that's totally okay. These are big, complex topics and we're just getting started. If you found this episode helpful, or at least mildly less confusing than your last Google search, we'd love it if you subscribed, left a review, or shared it with someone who might also be stuck in the hormonal neurological Venn diagram. If you've got questions, thoughts, or a theory you'd like to share with us, we're all ears. Drop us a line or follow us on socials. Thanks for watching, and remember, even if the fog rolls in, you're not alone. Until next time. You've worked hard your whole life to get where you are. You've built expertise, earned respect. We'll share the links to the resources in the show notes. And if any of our listeners have questions or any topics you'd like discussed in future episodes, email us at support@thefogandthefury.com and we'll get back to you. So that's a wrap on this episode of The Fog and the Fury. If your brain's still buzzing or maybe just pleasantly foggy, that's totally okay. These are big, complex topics, and we're just getting started. If you found this episode helpful, or at least mildly less confusing than your last Google search, we'd love it if you subscribed, left a review, or shared it with someone who might also be stuck in the hormonal neurological Venn diagram. If you've got questions, thoughts, or a theory you'd like to share with us, we're all ears. Drop us a line or follow us on socials. Thanks for watching, and remember, even if the fog rolls in, you're not alone. Until next time. You've built expertise, earned respect,